romantic thing. But when that person, comes to the faith and they find God, that body count still exists, right? Unless you think that it doesn't.
It still does.
Right. So you agree that there could be a perfectly suitable partner for a man who is a Christian, right? And one of the things that happened to be in her past was that, she had all of these sexual partners, but now she has, found Christ. Mm-hmm. So in that case, it wouldn't be right for him to consider that if she's changed.
Yeah, no, it would be totally right for him to consider it.
Why would he consider that?
Because it would still show a pattern of not upholding the same virtues he's looking for.
In the past, but not currently. But if she's currently upholding those values.
Well, your past behaviors is generally a really good indication of your future behavior.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine to say, but if he has really good overriding evidence that she will never do that again, that she, will go forward and be...
I don't know what evidence he could have for that.
Let's just say he has some evidence, regardless.
Yeah,
but if he has that evidence...
Yeah, if you were to say, like, he had a crystal ball in front of him,
right,
and he could see the whole future, sure, I wouldn't dispute that. But that would be baked into the fact of knowledge itself. He has pre-existing knowledge this will not happen, or some really overwhelmingly good, compelling evidence it wouldn't. But absent that, which I would argue in most cases they wouldn't have, then it would show a pattern of behavior against the same virtues he's looking for, where he could select for somebody who's upheld those virtues.
There's also, so that's fine to say that if he has reason to believe that she'll still engage in those behaviors, regardless of whether or not she's in a committed relationship with him, that's a kind of separate question, but an adjacent question. Because the question is she going to be promiscuous in this relationship? Presumably, like if you take somebody who has like a large body count, they're usually not in relationships with those people.
No, it's not. Well,
unless you disagree.
I dispute the premise here a bit. I'm going to quibble a little bit, but I think I'm fine quibbling on this point. Okay. So my quibble is it's not really necessarily even a sign that she will be promiscuous, though I think it's there. Only a sign that she's perhaps not upholding virtues. She doesn't have a pattern of upholding virtues. So I think that, like any behavior, like if you're a practicing Christian or a practicing Muslim, let's say, they hold set values for what virtues are. And just sure. Like language, communication, and all forms of different habits which are formed in people, they're done by exercising them over and over and over again. So if you're a person who is high in virtue, you're probably consistently exercising virtues as part of your habit, right? You're stopping let's give a stupid example, like you're always stopping on the side of the road to help people, or you're always, you know what I mean? That becomes habit after a while. After a while, you almost can't help but pull off on the side of the road to help somebody because it's so habitually built up in you. So I think that for them, this could be a great red flag sign that, wait, these habits, these virtue habits aren't really formed yet, especially if you're a new Christian, right? Or you just came to Christ in this sense. These habits haven't even had a chance to flower yet. And if you could select for somebody who's upheld them, why wouldn't you do that?
Right, so then it's not the necessarily body count thing. It's more so about whether or not the trend that happened in the past will continue, and whether or not that person will adopt to the virtues that you have.
Well, it is body count, though, because body count would be the virtue which is being broken.
Right, but they're breaking that when they're not a Catholic or not a Christian, right? So it's kind of like you're saying, like, okay, well, I want to hold you to the standard of this religion where we have these specific virtues, but I'm going to hold your past self who's not involved in that religion to that standard. And that doesn't quite make sense. So there could be, and I think in most cases, probably, when you look at people who come to Catholicism or to the church in general, and they say, hey, I'm reformed, I want to get my life turned around, I want to stop drinking, I want to stop partying, whatever, XYZ, that you would find to be like vices. I think that it's probably likely that that person should take that as a strong consideration into the relationship.
You didn't actually give a reason for why that doesn't quite make sense, though. You said that doesn't quite make sense, but then you gave a reason that actually still makes sense. You can indeed hold people to your ethical worldview and ethical standard even before they adopted it. And you can say, based on the pattern of behavior pre-adopting my standard, you did not uphold to it, so I have good reason to believe you will not in the future, at least as of right now, until otherwise demonstrated, like we would do with all pattern recognition behavior.
Yeah, that's fair. So what I'm saying here is that there's overriding considerations. I'm saying that, like, if you talk to a person, which I would assume this would be the case in, like, the courting sense, you typically don't just, like, have someone be your girlfriend the next day, especially not in, like, religious traditions. Mm-hmm. It's typically that, you get to know the person first. So with that assumption in mind, I would say that you're probably getting to know this person first, and then you're saying, okay, well, how much confidence do I have that now that they're part of the faith, now that I know this person, that they're going to uphold these values in the future?
Yeah.
And are they going to uphold them under the conditions of this religion? Because in the sense, we talked about this earlier, they are likely not in relationships with those people. So what you're asking is, are you going to stay in a relationship with the person that you're, like, sexually active with or something like that?
And
right?
you have good reason to believe at that point, perhaps not.
Sure, you might have that as a consideration.
Sure.
But the consideration of, like, in the Catholic faith, like I said, you don't get into a relationship with somebody the next day. So it's likely for the average person and for Catholics, I would say.
Yeah, but you see that there's a fundamental flaw there, which is, yeah, that's true. You don't get into relationships with them the next day, but this would give you good cause to not ever get into the relationship at all. This is the problem, right? It's like
after you've gotten to know the person?
No.
Sorry.
Well, you're not giving a chance to even know the person because you just go, okay, because I'm a pattern recognition machine, right? This isn't what I'm looking for because there's too much potential for X based on how many of these virtues that you have routinely broken, right? And so I don't want to waste my time with you developing good habits for virtues again or something like this. They have good cause to just pass those women up completely.
Well, those women have a reason to follow the virtues now, whereas they might not have when they were atheists. So
yeah, but go ahead.
That's kind of like saying, you never gave me a reason for, riding my bike being wrong. And then suddenly I adopt this religion where riding my bike is wrong. Well, obviously I'm going to have a pattern of, doing some very wrong things under this religion. But once I adopt this religion, I now have a reason to adhere to that. So those women do have a reason to adhere to that.
Yeah, but the reasons the problem with that argument is that the reasons can be as superficial as I want to buy a new reputation. Example, let's say you're an OnlyFans model and you decide that you don't want the societal or social stigma that comes with that anymore. And one venue that you've seen other women successfully have this stigma kind of removed from them is by converting to a certain religious sect. Inside of that religious sect, then they're essentially using that now as some type of purpose to buy a new reputation, whether they actually believe in the dogmas of it or the virtues of it or not.
Right, but you would say that I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that people don't, go around, make mistakes and then want to rebrand themselves and
it's constant, right?
Be perceived in a particular way. Of course, people want to be perceived in specific ways all the time.
Agreed.
What I am saying though is that if a Catholic were to meet someone else in the Catholic tradition, they would have overriding reasons not to consider body count so strongly because they know that this person has now adopted the Catholic faith, or at least they have good reason to believe so. I mean, I would assume that you don't just go around thinking people are just lying or...
Well,
you would think you have a good reason to believe.
Well, inside of religions, Christianity particularly, we have various ways of testing what we would call perhaps the fruits of the Spirit or the sins of the flesh or various things like that. Within Orthodoxy, for instance, the example is all sin, right? Like, let's say you have that cup. Let's say sins could be considered, I guess, equivalent to each other in badness. But one sin can fill this cup up way faster than another type of sin, though it's just as bad, right? The sin itself, the corruption that's left behind by the sin could be worse. So inside of this tradition, let's say, if that's the case, then a person who has had their cup filled to the brim with sin, right, probably going to take much longer time for them to develop good habits to not do those same corrupting types of behaviors. So it would actually give people a fairly good reason to steer clear of promiscuous women, right? Or women who slept with many, many people when it comes to the virtue of chastity, especially, because they would see this as, well, though you have been forgiven for these sins, right? And you will be continuously forgiven for these sins. You haven't actually built up the habits for being able to exercise, not filling that cup right back up, right? That's the idea there.
Sure. I mean, I'm fine with saying that there's some people who have reason to reject some people based off of their body count. Now, whether or not that's like on
So body count
face
matters.
value, in some scenarios, maybe this is probably a miscommunication thing or a kind of like what we talked about before, where people, when they say things, they usually don't make universal statements.
That's true.
Where it's kind of like, okay, you think that I'm saying X, but I'm really saying X like with an asterisk. And that's why I brought up that statistic about the people who are in between on body count numbers, like where the people who have low body counts tend to have high failure rates and the people who have really high body counts tend to have high failure rates, whereas the people kind of in between have decent marriages, decent relationships, whatever
you
the
could
study
chalk that
is
up to things like impulse
specifically.
control and all sorts of other things, I'm sure. But
Well, sure, there could be tons of things,
Yeah.
but that's what I'm saying. Your average person probably doesn't have a good reason to say like, okay, well, that person, has a specific body count and my number is 3 and my cutoff is 3.
I think the average person, if the average person still is following Christian ethics, which I would argue inside of this country, at least so far, it is still the case that most people are trying to follow some variation of Christian ethics. Like that would be the overarching prevailing ethical system in the nation, at least as of now. Now that's changing, but I think that that's the purview. If that's the purview, then I would say that probably the majority of men who are within, whatever that majority minority is, do have great cause to question body count and to look at it from a virtue standpoint as like, look, this is really bad, right? This is a really bad behavior. And can I bypass this behavior to go with somebody who does uphold these virtues? Or do I or do I select for this to begin with to even try to kindle a relationship, knowing the amount of work that could come into flexing these new virtues? You know what I mean?
Yeah, like I said, so because what you're doing here is taking the set of people who are Christian or Christian adjacent-ish, who might want to uphold the same types of values, and then you're taking a subset of people who it might be good for them to weed people out for like having a higher body count.
I would just take the men, yeah.
You don't think that women should weed out for like high body counts amongst men?
Yeah, I think they should.
Okay. So I was just curious why you said that.
I just think from their end, well, because here when we're talking about body count, I assume that we were discussing it between should men care about it, right? Because it seems to be that men care about it a lot more than women care about it. And there could be evolutionary arguments for why that is. But regardless of that, from the Christian view, yes, I even think that women should be looking at that as well. Like if you're a chaste virgin woman, right? Yeah, I think you have totally great cause to look at a man's body count and assess that as being potential behavior for whether or not he just wants to deflower you. Don't you agree with that?
I think that would be a consideration if you knew more information about people. So it's kind of hard to tell there in those cases, and that's why I say it's like very individualistic. And I think
something as simple as just he has a profile where he's like, I've screwed 150 women. Like, isn't that enough? Like, what more information do you need?
Well, that's why I said like the general cases. Like, yeah. I think your general person might have some concern there.
Yeah.
But the difference here is like the cases. This is obviously given the case where you're interested in dating somebody, and they've kind of also affirmed that as well, because what we're taking here is a data set where like people aren't interested in dating somebody. Obviously, it's kind of impossible for your average person to like have sex with 200 people, over the span of a few years, and also be in relationships with all of those people. So you're taking the standard where they're not in relationships with people versus where they're in relationships with people, because the concern there would be either just hooking up with me to, leave me alone, or the concern would be like cheating. Well, it doesn't increase the probability that they're going to cheat, because prior, that wasn't cheating, right? So the concern there is them leaving you. Well, if you know information about that person that would lead you to believe that they actually do want a relationship, something like they're reformed in the faith, or maybe they've just changed their standards over time and they've shown you behavior patterns like this would kind of be like, I wouldn't jump into a relationship with somebody like that anyways. So why would I, and like that I don't mean body count wise, I mean like I wouldn't jump into a relationship in that manner. So why would I like jump into them like without knowing their body count? That kind of thing would come later after I already know that person has an interest.
Why select for them anyway?
Why select for
if other options are available for women who have a lower body count, thus at least giving an immediate demonstration that they uphold at least some of the chastity virtue. Why not just move and select for them instead of selecting for the ones who have a higher body count anyway? Why, in other words, if you only have X amount of time to find the type of partner that fits your preferences, why not just go ahead and bypass this under the assumption that, hey, I have good evidence, reasonable evidence immediately to believe that there's going to be a lot more work that goes into her trying to exercise these new virtues if she's a recent convert, or if she was a convert before, like let's say she was born into it, something like this, and just violated it over and over again. Now you have evidence to the contrary that she's following the faith anyway, right?
Yeah, that's an additional factor to account for. So that's kind of where it gets a little bit tricky there, is the person who has been in the faith and then has either left the faith or violated it or something like that, where they've shown like a clear disdain for those values. That might be something to take into account for. And that's fine. I'm fine saying with that body count is something that can be factored in. I just don't think for a lot of people it's the main thing that should matter. I think that if you meet somebody, you shouldn't even be like, in a relationship with them in the first place, just off the bat. I think that once you get to know them, you should have that judgment, whether or not they're good, and then you can factor in body count.
Yeah, when we're speaking past each other is you keep on bringing up, well, you're already getting to know them to be in a relationship with them, right? What I'm saying is that if you have this pertinent information, why even bother selecting for it to begin with? And I do think that you are underestimating how valuable this information is, and here's why. There isn't that much which you can point to immediately for the purposes of virtue to know, based on a person's past history, unless it's criminal or something like this, or gossip, right, that I can really point to immediately where I could say from a Christian worldview, that right there shows a lack of virtue, right, or shows a pattern of behavior of you doing something that you're really not supposed to be doing. That's something super immediate that you can point to right away based on past history that you can ascertain reasonably quickly. I can't think of too many other things in the virtue department you can do that with. So I do think it is important.
Okay, so I mean, I kind of already went over this, and maybe this point wasn't like made or honed in enough, because you're once again taking the subset of people who are religious, who think that those are religious values, because you could very well have like somebody who's religious who just thinks that it's like a virtue to go and sleep with everybody and anybody as soon as possible.
Well, not the majority minority, but yeah.
Sure,
go ahead.
Right, but I'm saying that you're taking this set of people who believe these particular like values or virtues or whatever, and then you're saying, okay, well, some of those people have reason to select for people with lower body counts. And even then, they still have data that kind of goes against that and says like, okay, well, with the data, maybe they are following the virtues, but there's actually less success in these relationships where the body counts are lower.
No, the data doesn't show that with virgins.
I would have to look at the data again. That's
it doesn't.
Just an empirical claim.
But they don't have. That is not the case with virgins. They do not. It does not show a lack of success, especially if the husband and the wife are virgins. Then it becomes even more successful.
Right, and then there's more issues with the methodology there in collecting that data. And it's not on the. I'm not saying it's on the fault of the researchers.
Yeah, but we
I'm
can't
just saying
quibble.
That it is one of those things that's hard to do.
We can't quibble over the methodology that we can't.
Of course we can.
assess.
I'm a psych major.
That we can't assess. Hang on. That we can't assess right now. We can't quibble over the methodology because you don't know what the methodology is off the top of your head.
It gives me reason to be suspicious, and I think that you.
That's
would say
fine.
that.
You can have reason to be suspicious, but I'm just saying that the data itself at least isn't showing. You can quibble about the methodology of it, and you can say, here's what I don't like about it, here's what I do like about it. That's totally fair. But I didn't even present that argument to you. I'm just saying I'm taking that off the table because it's not provable or unprovable, at least for the purpose of the debate. But what we can at least logically demonstrate is that a good subset of people do hold the values of virtue in Christian ethics, and that this body count is an easy thing to ascertain, whereas other virtuous behavior is not immediately apparent. That one often is.
Of course. Well, I would actually reject that. I think that it's easier to ascertain information about people's virtuous status. Like, say they used to be a consistent liar. Say they used to be a consistent thief or something like that. Mm-hmm. Well, you can ascertain like, okay, well, they did this before they were religious. Maybe they have been a few years clean of doing this before they became religious. Mm-hmm. So you can ascertain that that person probably is adhering to the values not only beforehand, but during this relationship. So that's what I'm saying that.
Yeah, but I wouldn't disagree with that
I'm not saying
point.
that do you think that what I'm saying is that
religious
people can't or should never take into account people's body count?
No.
Yeah,
I'm
I'm
saying
not
that
committing myself to that.
I think that you're saying it's. I just think that what you're doing is you're grading the impact of it lower than where it actually should be graded. So I think that it is something which is major. That is a portion of men's concern when it comes to Christianity, the body count of a woman. Other things that they could take into account would be children with other men. That would be another good one. Or, there's all sorts of various different things that could show that perhaps they're not exercising the virtue. They have children out of wedlock, various things like this. On the other hand, you can make an argument, well, it's perhaps more virtuous in some ways because they kept a child and didn't abort it. Maybe that is in comport with the ethical system. But the body count itself, outside of marriage, easy one to point to because it's just always universally in basically every Christian denomination going to be considered non-virtuous behavior, right? It's going to be considered a violation of the ethical purview of Christians themselves. So it's an easy one to point to. And I haven't actually heard a refutation to that. Just, yeah, but there could be other factors you could point to as well. It's like, yeah, maybe, but I haven't heard why this one should actually be trivialized.
I'm not saying that it should be trivialized. And that's I think there's some Christian men, and probably a lot of them, who probably should value the people who have their similar ideals about intercourse with people. I think that there are a lot of men who are Christian who should do that. And I think there's a lot of Muslim men who should do that. And I think I'm just saying that when the body count discussion is framed as this is an immediate disqualifier of somebody, I think that removes all of the nuance out of dating and relationships. And I think that one of the Christian values is to find nuance, find compassion for other people. And I think that you're exhibiting a virtue of compassion when you kind of look and say hey, I know everybody's history isn't perfect, but I want to get to know this person for who they are now, for who Christ has made them now. Yeah. And I think that that's virtuous on its own. And just to once, for I'll say this, I don't think that there's nobody who should ever take body count into consideration. I just don't think for the average person it should be the main focus of considering someone as a partner.
Okay, well then let's move from the Christian perspective just to the secular then. My argument from the secular perspective is that body count would also be a great indicator for you just based on revolt factor for preference. So most men, they find it revolting that women sleep with tons and tons of men, right? If they find it to be revolting and that's within their preference, there's nothing wrong with that, and they should select past it so that they're not trying to have a relationship with a woman that they're actually revolted by.
Yeah, I think for those men who it's extremely revolting and there's no way to get around that for them, then they probably should. But I think there's a lot of men who if they had relevant data about the types of relationships they could cultivate with people who have had higher body counts in the past, that they would probably, and by higher, I mean, we can put a number on that if you really want to, but I'm just talking about people in that mid-range.
Do you think that if men had relevant data that they could have great and fantastic romantic homosexual relations with other men, that they would suddenly have a preference towards having a homosexual relationship, even if the data said that it would end well for them?
Some of them might lean more towards that.
Almost none. You really think that men would go, I'm totally straight and attracted to women, but now that I see that I could have a bigger house and a pool if I become a homosexual, I'm going to suddenly start having gay. So you really think that?
Yeah. Well, there are people who do that. It's kind of like saying.
No, there are people. Most men would not go for that, right?
I didn't say most men. I didn't say most.
You did. I say you think most men would go for that, and you were like, yeah.
No. I said that would lean most people more towards possibly developing a preference for that. So it's not that most men would in fact become gay. I didn't say that.
Or even engage in homosexuality. I mean, if they find homosexuality revolting, there's no amount of data that you're going to show them where they're like, oh, well, now that I see that I could get a bigger pool, the act of gay sex is less revolting to me, right?
I think, have you ever heard the phrase $20 is $20? I mean, come on. I think people genuinely.
That's literally making fun of degenerates. Do you say that because it's making fun of degenerates?
You don't think there's actually people, there's a whole, there's actually a wonderful sociologist, and I will shout out Dr. Jenny Stuber for doing a presentation on this. There are people who will go gay for pay. Yeah, absolutely. People are incentivized to do things when they realize that there's positive outcomes for them.
Yeah, there are some, I would never put it in a monolith. that there could be some men, like for instance, in the adult corn industry, there's men who have, gays who are apparently straight, according to what they say, right?
Yeah.
They have to have fluffers, though, come in and, get them to the point where they can do it. Because they can't do it on their own, right? Because they have zero traction there. A lot of them even can find it revolting. Do I think that there are some men who would sell out for this? Sure. But that was never a dispute. Yeah. I'm just saying overwhelmingly, no, you're not going to be able to change men's mind by saying, well, this could be a positive romantic outlook that you now have, or you could have a wonderful life with a man of the same sex if you find it revolting. That's not going to change most of their minds.
Do you think most men at least
and I mean the overwhelming majority, like I would say like 99.9% or higher, you're not going to change their minds.
Sure. Do you think the overwhelming set of straight men are more adverse to like the thought of themselves having like homosexual intercourse than they are to like a woman with a slightly higher body count number than they prefer?
Yeah.
You think they're more adverse to the homosexual?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm. So then when you take that into account with that, you're saying like, okay, well, look, yeah, they might be completely repulsed by the thought of having homosexual sex, but when they're given, other incentives to do so or more information about the facts of what it would cause for them, then they're more likely to do that, whether or not that amount is
Well, let me counter with this real quick, which would just be, I agree that there's a lower subset of men who are revolted by promiscuous women than are by gay sex, but within that subset of men who are revolted by women with a high body count, it's just as bad as the men who are completely revolted by gay sex. It would be the same thing.
You're saying the amount of men is lower?
Yeah, so if you just say the amount of, isn't the amount of men who are repulsed by gay sex going to be higher than the amount of men who are repulsed by women with a high body count? Right. It's like, but that really doesn't mean anything because we're looking at the subset of men they're equally repulsed, right? They're just repulsion is repulsion.
I'm not actually convinced of that. I'm far more repulsed by the thought of like eating dog shit than I am at the thought of like eating pickles, and I really hate pickles. So that you're saying like, you're
you can have that trivially, right? And maybe I can concede a bit. Maybe I am quibbling a little bit, but what my point is that just because there's a larger subset who finds this to be repulsive with gay sex, there is a large subset of men who find it repulsive that women have a high body count. And I think it's higher than your aversion to pickles, and I think it's less high than the aversion to homosexual sex.
Right, but we can take a poll of the people in this room. Like, would you rather have sex with like a woman who has a high body count, or would you rather have sex with a man? And I think most of the people in this room would be like, I'd rather have sex with a woman with a high body count. So that's just evidence in favor of the hypothesis.
Yeah,
that, they would.
But it's to the matter of degree. Like I said, it's higher than your aversion to pickles. Right, but perhaps less high than homosexual sex. But the point remains that if they're repulsed by it, and that's within their preference, it seems a perfectly good argument to say it's not my preference, and then just avoid those women altogether because it's outside their preference.
Right, but just like the case with the virgins, what that does is when you say, I'm just averse to it, and like I said, I'm excluding these extreme cases of like aversion. I think that those people who have extreme aversion to this thing that like the aversion can't really be manipulated or changed or, to have better outcomes, I think those people probably should. And that's the same thing that I would say. Like, I think people who have like a really strong preference against like eating pickles, those people probably shouldn't eat pickles, even though they really want to, have a bigger data set about what it might be like to eat pickles or something like that. So the point stands there is that I think there's far more men who would have intercourse with a woman with a higher body count. I think that aversion can be manipulated so that their data set can be expanded and they can find happier relationships.
Would you apply that same logic to conversion therapy then?
To convert, in what way?
In the same way that if it is the case that they're opening up their experience to the fact that, they could see that their life would be far less stigmatized if they became heterosexuals or only engaged in heterosexual sex, and that they would have far better outcomes, that there's a lot of gay men who could be convinced, as it were, to do this thing that they found repulsive.
That's an empirical claim. So if you're asking me if
I need one final statement on the body count question from each of you.
Oh, okay. So. Well, I'll just let you go ahead and end, and then I'll end.
Sure. Okay.
And then we'll do chats, then we'll do close.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, I think in quite a bit of cases, I would be able to say that, for most people, it would be worth it to consider somebody with a higher body count than they have a preference for. I believe when you look at the preferences for body count amount, it's actually pretty low, and it probably falls into that lower end of the spectrum where you have like people who are like from the 1 to 3-ish range. And I think for those people, which I would say is the majority of people, they should open up the range to the kind of middle ground where people tend to have more successful relationships.
Yeah, well, I would just say that my opponent never actually made a really good claim for why men shouldn't care about this, only that there's a possibility that some men can be rehabilitated against their revulsion from a secular aspect. That, of course, that would bring up the can of worms of conversion therapy, right? Same thing when it came to the revulsion of homosexual sex. And then further, I would say from the Christian sense, she didn't really make any refutations at all, only saying that, yes, from the Christian angle, it seems that body count itself would be very important for somebody who is looking for virtue in a partner, and that she's not adverse to that at all. So I don't really understand. I still don't really understand the position. I'm trying not to straw man it. I'm trying to steel man it, but I feel like that rendition of events is actually pretty accurate.
There might have to be a further conversation on that because there is still some confusion, but oh well.
Okay, yeah. We're going to let a bit of chats come through here.